Well, hello, and thank you for watching. It's lovely to be with you. I'm Mick Waters. I'm a patron of NAPE. I've lots of experience in primary education, and I just want to share a few thoughts with you about the way in which children see their learning and what we can do to help that be as successful as possible in the eyes of the pupil. You know, recently I was in a classroom, in a reception classroom, as you are sometimes, just sort of having a look around, and the teacher was doing that lovely stuff teachers do with children. They were gathered around on the floor, probably 10 of them, and she was doing things with blocks and doing counting. So she did four, and then she added one, and 4 plus 1 is 5, and they all said 5, and 5 plus 1 is, and they all said 6. And then she put the 6, and she added one more, a yellow one, and she said 6 plus 1 is, and they all said 7. And it was lovely. A little boy to the side said 5 plus 2 is 7 as well, which sort of knocked her off course, really, because she was adding one. That was the point of it. And she said, "Oh, well done" to the little boy. And she gave him a sticker, which is the way they do things in this school, which I presume later converts to some other currency. And that was it. And a bit later on, around the reception, when they'd all finished this and they were playing, I came across this little lad and I said, "Cool, you know your numbers, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "You knew that 6 and 1 was 7 and that 5 and 2 was 7 as well." He said, "Yeah, 4 and 3 is 7 as well." But I didn't tell her. And I loved it because on the one hand, you wonder, was he not telling her because it's a secret, or because she didn't know, or because it would ruin the session for her, or what? A bit later on, he was out on the yard, or the play area outside, and out there were all these tractors and things. But there was also this big number square painted on the playground going up to 100, 1 to 10 in 10 rows. And he came up to me because we'd had this chat and said, "Hello, how are you?" And we were chatting. I said, "You know the numbers, don't you?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Can you find 33?" And he ran and stood on the square number 33. And then he ran to, when I told him, 48, and he ran to 48. And I said, "Can you find 88?" And he knew immediately that it was rose to the, if you like, the upper end. And I said, "Can you find 74?" And he knew that was back around along a bit. And I just thought it was interesting, really, because there he is in the classroom playing that game with the teacher, 6 plus 1, 7 plus 1, playing along, being a really nice little boy. And he is a nice little boy. I really enjoyed being with him. But how much more could he do if we asked the question the other way round? And what do you know about number? What does number tell us? How can we make numbers work? And sometimes I think the sort of current move in early years profiles and progression maps in primary education lead us to taking children along a sort of pathway, a ladder of learning, without recognizing where they are or looking closely at what they know and what they don't know, and working out how to help them. So I'm just going to go through a few thoughts and see what you think. Another classroom I was in was sort of lower key stage 2, and these children were doing that thing that teachers do, where you write on a whiteboard and hold it up, and they were doing subtraction, 3-digit subtraction, as you can see here. So the teacher's technique was to show these examples, do them on the board, and then say to children, "Can you do this one?" And then the children would do it on their whiteboard, hold it up, and if they got it correct, she said, "Well done." And if they did it incorrectly, she said, "Have another go," which is fine. Have another go is a fine thing to do. But of course, if you're having another go when you don't know what to do, you probably get it incorrect until you randomly land on the right 3 digits. Now, in this case, this is a correct one. All these children were sitting together. These are over-the-shoulder assessments done with my camera. So there's 158 is the answer, and this child is correct. Got a little box there ready to put his tick in. Look. On this one, this child is incorrect. Should have been 158, and he's got 168. On this one, in the next door, this child's incorrect, and she's got 162. Now, you can see, can't you, what she's done wrong? She's taken the 7 from the 9. She's looked at the bigger number, bigger digit, and taken the smaller digit away, and that's her incorrectness. When she turns to the teacher and shows this, what the teacher says is, "Not correct, have another go," which is lovely because it's not sort of cast in stone. It can be rubbed out, all those things. But how does not correct, have another go, help the child to know what's not done or what's done incorrectly? Now, if you look at this one's got it wrong as well. And is she more wrong or less wrong than the previous one? So she's done the first bit correct. Look, 17 minus 9 when you've done that sort of moving figures about. And now we've got 18 minus 2. If I don't know, we've got all over the place there. Then she's got the 2 and the 1 and somehow ended up with a 0. So there's one that needs a bit of untangling. And wouldn't it have been easier if we'd have had this stuff and been moving numbers around in a physical sense to keep it going? And you know, when children are using this, they feel at ease with the working of it. Of course, it's slower, isn't it? We've got to do everything quickly these days, and children have got to do it mentally because Nick Gibb thinks that not being able to do things mentally is a handicap in life, and true enough, it is. But of course, you need to do the concrete operation or use an apparatus before you get onto the mental stages of it. So if we went back to that first one, you look at where he's gone wrong, and he's got the incorrect answer, as the teacher said. And closer examination might lead us to believe that actually he hasn't got it incorrect. It's just that the 5 is not really very good at all, and it's become a 6. Can you see? And when I talked to the child, he could not fathom out why 158 wasn't correct. And so what he needs is not mathematics practice, but writing practice, the ability to form a digit so that other people can read it and make sense of it. Now, I'm talking about all this because I think children do see a very, very strange world in the classroom. And if we're not careful, it becomes unconnected and it doesn't make sense. And what teachers are looking for and what we're looking for in the education system is children making sense of their learning in a really sensible way. Now, I know a lot of you watching this will be subject leaders and people who are trying to help teachers make sense across the curriculum. So I want to move away from mathematics and talk about the curriculum generally and talk about the sorts of things we're aiming for in the way the curriculum unfolds. And the curriculum only works when you get pedagogy working with it. We use the right technique in teaching with the curriculum that we want to teach. I'm going to build a grid up, and the grid will work like this. Look, what we really want is deep learning, isn't it? Surface learning doesn't get us very far. It's exciting, but it doesn't take us into deep understanding. And of course, the other challenge is to get children looking at big questions as opposed to fragmented knowledge and skills. And if you build that into a quadrant, what you get is the real ambition for us in primary education should be to look at the top right-hand corner of this grid, where we get deep learning about big issues and questions. That's real education and takes us further forward. If we go around this grid, you can see the differences in the approach. So if we're in the bottom left-hand corner, the lower left-hand corner, what you see is fragmented skills and learning being taught in a very surface way. And that actually is just decontextualized learning. It's lots of activity which we might call rote learning. Not that there's anything wrong with rote learning, but it's learned in a rote way. It's decontextualized, so it's sort of out of context. So we learn phonics without learning about beautiful books. We learn mathematics in fragments without really seeing where they fit. If you get in the upper left-hand corner, then what you see there is big questions being addressed in surface ways. And they often become the one-offs and the special events that in primary schools we often celebrate and enjoy. In secondary schools, we sort of give a break from the routine of the lessons that children experience. Down in the lower right-hand segment of this quadrant, we see what is the balance between fragmented knowledge and skills and deep learning, because you do get deep learning through disciplined study. And a lot of secondary schools are really in this box, because what they do is they take the learning that children have got to do over the course of their time in secondary school and fragment it down into 1-hour chunks, which is very, very well organized. And it becomes disciplined study that's very deep, as long as children can keep up with it and make sense of it. And the upper right-hand quadrant, which is the one we really want to be getting to, is where you get connected, authentic learning for children, where they see connections. And because they see connections, it's authentic and makes sense, and they see where it fits. Now, if we're trying to drive towards that top right-hand quadrant, then what we need to do is look at the way in which those things appear to children. So let's have a look at the bottom left-hand quadrant in terms of how it appears for children and where it takes them. See, what you get in that is the teacher becomes the deliverer. Today I've got planned for you a lesson on, and sometimes it's relative drudgery. It's quite hard to sort of keep going. But children typically only have to comply with it. They have to do it. They fill in a printed sheet, or they fill in a grid, or they do a short piece of writing using a fronted adverbial. And children often really enjoy this thing. And the problem is that when I say often, it's the winners who enjoy it, and the ones who can't make sense of it become the losers. You very quickly get children saying, I'm not as good as Amrit, or I'm not as good as Arthur, or Arthur's much better than me at. And so what you get is this sort of picture of a classroom that is orchestrated by a teacher, very, very busy, but actually really just ploughing around very small issues a lot of the time. If we go to the upper left-hand quadrant, what we see there is children experiencing one-off special events. And typically they enjoy these. They're good fun, they're memorable. And the teacher, of course, enjoys them as well because they've been the arranger. And children love it because it's sort of comfortable. It's just really nice to do. And there's nothing at all wrong with these one-off special events. What would be better if we took them deeper? I go to schools where children have studied World War II, and they tell me they had a smashing day. They went on a steam train carrying a suitcase, evacuated to a nearby place, feeling what it was like to be evacuated. And I say to the teacher, that was really good. That's an excellent thing to do. Did we sort of push it forward and talk to the children about how it must have felt to be evacuated? The difference was all your children of today, they knew they were coming back at the end of the day. The children who were evacuated had no idea when they would be back again, when they would see their parents again. They didn't get allocated to adults they never met to look after them today. They came back having had lovely lunches on the train and enjoyed themselves, but did they really get underneath the surface of what it was like? At the end of the World War II project, there's often a street party to recreate the sort of joy of the end of the war. And they're brilliant, but do the teachers push it deeper by saying, let's have this good, fun and memorable day, as it was at the end of the war, but let's give children the rations they would have had on those days. Not these great big parties where they bring amazing bags of crisps and incredible amounts of food and modern day food. Let's give them the sort of rations they would have had on those days. So it's a question of how do we take that and make it a bigger question and deeper learning to go forward. In the bottom right-hand quadrant, what we see there is the teacher seen as the expert. They offer intellectual challenge, and more we're seeing this in primary schools where teachers are really becoming quite expert on the subject discipline that they're offering. And the intellectual challenge for children is far more demanding than it was a few years ago. The risk in this is children start to develop a concept of, I am a good geographer, or I'm not a historian. I am an artist, or I'm no good at languages. And with a segregated curriculum, which is often the case when we start to work with the teacher as the expert on science or maths or art or history, the risk is that children associate themselves with a subject and think that they're not good at that discipline. This is a real challenge in secondary, as we know, as children go through Key Stage 3, because they start to feel they're no good at physics, therefore they're no good at science, just on the basis of not being able to understand a couple of concepts, which if they'd come back to them later, they probably would have enjoyed. Now, the top right, which I'm trying to push you towards, is suggesting that the teacher isn't the expert as much as the authoritative architect of the experience children are having. And what the teacher tries to give is a real intellectual coherence to what they're offering, so that children are able to develop an integrated awareness of subject disciplines. Subjects don't sit separately, so science and maths do collide, and art collides with both of those. The history that we learn will collide and join in with the work we do in art. Look how much art is used to portray beliefs or events in history as we go forward. So those bigger questions are dealt with in a deeper way through the teacher being the authoritative architect of learning for children going forward. Now, that's not to say everything should be done in themes, but what it should show is the way in which learning should show is the way in which things connect, and the way things connect longitudinally. You did this last year. Do you remember that you might next year do this? And how one subject connects with another as children take learning forward. Now, this last slide on this bit is suggesting that what we try to do is drive everything towards that top right-hand corner. It's not that everything needs to be there. It could be that some learning is down in this surface learning, fragmented skills, bottom left-hand corner. There's a place for rote learning. There's a place for children to do things in a very structured, formal way. There's a place for one-off events, but the more those sorts of activities are pushed towards connection, and the more they're pushed towards authentic learning, the better for children and the better for their long-term prospects in work in school. Now, back in school, you might like to look at this slide and talk about it with colleagues in different year groups or colleagues responsible for different subject leadership, and ask whether we're thinking we're seeing connected, authentic learning as opposed to those other ones being isolated. Too often we see decontextualized learning sort of balanced by one-off special events. And as I said before, secondary schools often offer disciplined study and then one-off special events that are unconnected. So we have, don't we, in many schools around the country, we have World Book Day where children come dressed up as their favourite character from a book, which is gorgeous and lovely and offers opportunity to get into all sorts of texts. And sadly, then the next day, they're sort of informed that that's over now. And what we're doing is getting back to that very structured work in reading that we do every other day, but World Book Day. So how do we get these things to be really sucked into the connected, authentic experience? If we have a charity event like Red Nose Day or the Children in Need experience, do we really use the charitable event to help children to understand that some people are less fortunate than ourselves and that we can help them through goodwill and good acts? And do we really take it forward and help children to learn how to, if you like, count the money make sense in the bank, really sort of see where their contribution goes? I could go on for a long while, but this is, I think, a really good slide for you, perhaps talk about in school and consider in some depth. And what depth leads us to is consideration of what I call greater foundation depth. In a lot of schools over the last little while, I've been trying to get people to realise what it means to take learning deeper as we go into what Ofsted often call deep dives. They're really into deep dives, aren't they? I'm wondering why they don't injure themselves, because I think so many subject disciplines in our schools are treated at such a shallow level that when they dive in deeply, they'll bang their head on the bottom before very long. And I have to say, Ofsted's inspection reports on their deep dives are really indicating a rather trivial attempt to get into depth in teaching for children. If we really do subject disciplines well, and we really want children to understand deep, coherent learning that's authentic, you'll hear children saying things like, I invented doing this way of doing things because this is my idea. I built on what the teacher showed me. They'll say things like, I found out information for myself. They'll say, we're now going to do this in our group to take it forward. They'll say, I'm glad I did this because it makes me realise bigger issues and bigger ideas. And you'll hear words like, I reckon, I think, I predict, I wonder. And you'll hear them asking themselves, each other, is it right? Is it true? Is it real? So this notion of greater foundation depth isn't just looking at the products that children offer and trying to make sense of them. It's taking them forward to really try and open up learning in the biggest way possible. Now that means we need to look at some of the key teaching roles in an adult in the way we go forward. And I just want to dwell on some of these words for a minute. I think adults in classrooms are being pushed to do these things for children. Latest government policy over many, many years now has pushed us to be controlling children much more, taking volition from children and really sort of grabbing the agenda, the teacher being the driving force in the classroom. Now, I believe the teacher's the driving force in the classroom, and I believe that teachers should exercise these words to a great degree. And I think the way that they exercise the words is because they need to capture children's imagination, control their urge to condition children and make children behave in very limited ways, limit the way that they put restrictions on children's learning and their thinking, drive forward experiences for children that make sense, and complicate the way in which they make learning come to children so that the children have to engage with it and really make sense. So what we need to do as an adult, I think, is to bring that learning to the fore in the best way possible by creating classrooms that open up possibilities for children rather than close them down. So if you took history and geography as a sort of little rocker switch, I think history and geography, which are being pushed at the minute to be very factual based, and children having knowledge and children being able to return that knowledge to the teacher whenever they're asked to. I think the real rocker switch is when you hear children start asking themselves questions like when, where, who, which are fundamental in history to take us forward. Of course, the last question is why? Why? And our history in England at the minute, our history teaching in England at the minute in primary schools is taking us to the top three of those questions, much more than it is to the bottom. But the learning in the top right-hand quadrant of my previous diagram would push children to be asking the why and using the when, where, and who to substantiate their conversations. I'm going to show you some slides from from a classroom where I was looking at the work they'd been doing on explorers and the way the children have been studying explorers over some time. They'd done really lovely work. The teacher had the children looking at different groups, in groups looking at different explorers, following their journeys, doing the when, where, and why, when, where, and who. And I'd given out some post-its and said to children, just write down some of the questions that have occurred to you in doing this work. So you've looked at Francis Drake and Christopher Columbus and Magellan, and you've looked at the people climbing Everest, and you've looked at people who explored different continents. What are the why questions you want to ask? And I'm just going to show you some of those on here. Look. One of the children wanted to know the three most famous explorers, because we kept learning about explorers, but you know, are they in order? Are some more famous than others? Did Howard Carter go all over the world? We keep hearing about him going to Egypt, trying to find these tombs of pharaohs. Did he go all over the world, or was that him? Was he really an explorer? Did anyone discover the North Pole, and if so, who? I think this is brilliant. The children had done about Shackleton, they'd done about Scott, they'd done about Amundsen, trying to get to the South Pole, that massive race to the South Pole. But virtually unmentioned was the North Pole. Did anybody try and get there? And those of us who are now older know that somebody did, and in the end, it was conquered in the same way, but with much less a sort of acknowledgement and notoriety. Which explorer travelled the furthest distance? No question mark, of course, but if you're bothered about that, you're bothered about the bottom left-hand corner, not the top right. This was a fascinating debate we had. We sort of used philosophy for children techniques in this, and it was absolutely brilliant to talk with the children about their explorers and who went the furthest. Most children said it was Neil Armstrong because he went up to the moon, and you know, Columbus had gone the furthest. And we had this big debate then about each explorer who's gone to places as yet unexplored probably thinks they're traveling the furthest distance, but Armstrong going to the moon was probably outstripped that. Of course, then we had a debate about whether Michael Collins may have traveled further. He was the astronaut in the mothership on the first moon landing, and he never landed, but he went around the moon several times while the others were on the moon. So he must have traveled the furthest distance. That led to another debate about whether furthest distance means furthest from Earth or whether it means furthest accumulated distance. And that, of course, led us into those astronauts who day by day go around in the space station and travel millions of miles in the course of their mission. So are they the ones? And in the end, of course, we didn't solve it. But my goodness me, we had lots of thought. And didn't it bring in mathematics well as geography and history? And what was the Scott of the Antarctic's real intention of travel with his crew? And was it to travel alone, or was it to travel with a big crew? You remember he gradually sort of left his crew behind, took a small group to the pole, got there after Amundsen, and then set off back, and gradually his crew disappeared around him. Can anyone be an explorer, or does someone have to name you one? I mean, that's right. Can any of us? We're growing up, and we're 11 now, but when we get to 15, can we just say we're an explorer, or do you have to be appointed? And is there a qualification for exploration, or do you just do it? And why did people ask other people to explore the world? And this comes around because you remember that Columbus went to Queen Isabella and asked whether he could have some money and whether she would grant his wish to explore. Well, she said she wanted to conquer different parts of the world and colonize it. So, you know, it's quite a nice question. Can you just do it, or does somebody have to tell you to do it? What is it that makes people explore and want to do it? I mean, there's philosophy all over the place, isn't it? Why do explorers take risks? These are really big questions. These are questions well beyond the who, what, when. These are big questions that we want children to grapple with. I mean, and in a sense, they're ones with no answer, which is one of the reasons we're less prone to do it. We're encouraging children's thinking rather than the correct answer, and much harder to mark. Why did explorers from history decide to take risks that would eventually lead to their death? And of course, so many of the ones that we discuss eventually did die. You know, Francis Drake, Captain Cook, many of the Everest explorers eventually couldn't make it to their goal, and they eventually died. Scott of the Antarctic on the way home, and all his crew. So these are really big philosophical questions which they'll only get into if they do deep, connected, authentic learning going forward. And so when teachers are planning, and when you're planning a theme or a piece of progression in a subject discipline, or whether you're planning a topic or a project, in the end, these are the things that we have to look at. Any unit of work, really, a lesson, excuse me, a lesson or a key stage or a term, how much of these really became deeply understood by children? You know, what do we want children to understand? And what knowledge do you want them to accumulate? What entitlements will every learner have? Do you want them to all experience the same thing, or do you want different groups to understand different things? But those inquiry questions, what do you want them to wonder about, or what I've been talking about over the last few minutes? How do you get children really wondering about big ideas, as well as accumulating knowledge and intellectual concepts? That notion of polished products I'm not dealing with this morning. How do we get learners to create, make, design high quality products? Not polished products because they've had one go and then another go, then another go. But how do they work through various drafts, as it were, of a piece of art, a piece of sculpture, a piece of music, to make it the best it can be? And what do we want them to know locally and globally, where they link their world to the bigger picture? And then structured wise, does it have to be stepped, which is the current vogue, isn't it? We have to have a progression map that creates steps in learning for children. Or can it sometimes just be incrementally random, a bit like orienteering, where while I'm at point 3, I'll take in point 7 and point 9 because they're near at hand and represent a relatively easy chase, whereas point 14 is uphill against the wind through the brambles, and we've got to make it work. And of course, in all that, pedagogy is absolutely vital, because that's what develops attitude and aptitude in children going forward. So I just want to go back to where I started, really, that children often, you know, wonder what's going on in classrooms. You see, this is children spread around a classroom, very small class, just 16 of us, and the teacher at the front where the tea is. And children must sit there wondering about conversations in classrooms at times. I've done it so many times. You say to children, can anybody tell me, or does anybody know? And then you ask the question. And I think children must think they're thinking, well, actually, you know, because you're asking the question. And the number of times I've, in my practice, told children the story of something famous, and at the end of it say, now I'm going to ask you questions about it. And actually, that's a really unusual thing. We don't do that in the real world, do we? In the real world, we ask questions that we need to know the answers to. And that's why we need the children asking them. This is the way questions work in classrooms for children. The teacher typically asks a question to a child there, and then the child answers, and the question comes back to another one. And then the child answers, and the teacher takes that question and gives it to another one. And the child answer, and often, you know, teachers are using that to keep control, to keep attention, as opposed to plunge deeply into the learning to take us forward. Now, this is really crucial stuff because there are other ways of doing it, which some teachers are really exploring in a big way. So the way we could do it is to ask that child over there a question, and when that child gives the answer, this child over here picks it up and adds to it, or challenges it, or questions it. And then that child over there says, well, I disagree with that, but what I think is, here's my idea. And a child over here says, well, I've been listening to all these, and what I'd like to ask everybody is whether if this is another angle on the issue. And then this child joins in and says, this is a really good discussion, but I'm wondering, and it goes over there, and this child says, well, I think the answer to that is, and at that point, the teacher says, you know, this has been a really good discussion. The points made by child A, child B, child C, and child D are absolutely essential. You know, they're really clever thoughts, and this is where we need to go forward as we move on. Now, the teacher's job at the end is to orchestrate the consideration, the discussion, the way in which we help children to move their thinking forward. And I think that if we could do that in classrooms, we'd see a very different attitude from children to their learning from that which we see at the minute, as the teacher then moves it to the next question. Add, build, and challenge is sort of catching on around the school system at the minute. And I see children in classrooms doing sort of gestures to show that they're ready to add, build, or challenge. And it's almost distracting now in the conversation because they're sort of waving their arms around, getting PE while they're in the lesson. But you can take on these letters, you know, and sort of start talking to children about how they can deduce things, focus things, how they can help each other in their conversation, how they'd like to pursue an idea or modify it, or judge it sometimes and say, oh, I'm not sure that's correct, or to link it with something else and take it forward. And they can test and underline, verify, wonder, and at times they could go, yes, well, and there we go. I couldn't think of a Z, so I didn't bother, but we could really explore some of these words with children to take them deeper into the subject and deeper into the world they know. I'm going to stop sharing to finish off because I just like to see you all, which is a silly thing to say because I can't see you. But I hope that you've enjoyed this little chat, and I hope that it's useful and adds to the other opportunities you're getting through the National Association of Primary Education to really think about what's on offer and what we do in our classrooms to help children understand the learning they're doing. I'll just point you at the end towards Philosophy for Children, and particularly the book by Roger Sutcliffe, which has lovely examples of how we can manage questions, and really worth looking at in terms of taking us forward. And I'd encourage you to look at things like Mantle of the Expert, an opportunity for children to engage in a dramatic setting through role play with the issue under discussion in a way that takes it really deep. Or forest schools, which open their doors to children, and done well, forest schools become a real opportunity to get into that top right-hand quadrant. Done poorly and done perfunctorily, they're a one-off special event. So those are the sorts of things that have grown without government pressure and without government centralised agenda, but grown over 30 years because teachers have been realising the benefit of being engaged in deep and worthwhile learning for their children. And another thing I'd point you towards is the work of Robin Alexander. He's done so much work on dialogic teaching, proper research based in classrooms. And in the end, what I've been talking about in this session is getting the children engaged in dialogue fundamentally enjoying engaging with their subject through talking about it. Let's have a look at Robin's work. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I hope that I've added something to the context of your school, and that you particularly enjoyed talking about that slide on the different sorts of learning and the different sorts of approaches to it. Do keep involved with NAPE. It's a brilliant organisation and tries to do its best to forward thinking about primary schooling. And the more you're involved and the more you contribute, the more you get out of it. Thanks for listening to me, and keep doing good things in your school.